Hello, my name is Kara Vandermiller, and I am a program coordinator with the International Students and Scholars Center at ASU. And you are attending the Let's Chat U.S. Culture Exposed. And today is a very relevant and important topic. Dr. Jessica Venus Nelson is presenting and going to ask questions, and hopefully we can get a small discussion going about the African American or Black experience here in the United States. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it all over to her, and really happy you're all here. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you guys for attending today. My computer froze, so hopefully we're still recording and you guys can hear me all right. Okay, good. But thank you so much. There's just a few of us, so I'm happy to have this be a little bit more informal than I had planned. I have about 25 minutes worth of remarks, but I'm happy to address questions off the bat as we go, whatever. It's, I try not to assume any knowledge of American history, and I try to do that with my American students too. There's a lot that they don't know coming into a course like I teach on African American history, but there's also a lot that they've been mistaught, right? And I think that'll be apparent soon why that is. And so I feel like I do most of my, or not most, but maybe about a third of my work is on unteaching. And so you're in good company if you're confused or have questions. And so I'm happy to address any of that. But I will get started, but feel free to interrupt in the chat or through the audio function. And I hope we have time for questions at the end too. So with that, I will start. And I always like to start with some James Baldwin. And so in 1964, in an essay entitled The White Problem, James Baldwin, an African-American novelist, thinker, and activist, wrote about a contradiction at the heart of the US's self-understanding. Baldwin said that we founded the nation upon the declaration that all men are created equal. And yet we were a nation in which 20% of the population was enslaved. That's 1 in 5 Americans were held in chattel slavery in 1776. To justify this, we had to solve this inconsistency in our founding creed. We could solve it by ending slavery, or we could solve it by saying that enslaved men and women, Black men and women, were not human beings and thus were not created equal. We chose the latter. If people of African descent weren't human beings, then no crime had been committed. If we insisted that the color of one's skin determined the relative value of an individual's life, then it justified the way American society was organized. So we built a nation predicated on the idea that white people matter more than others. And that decision has stayed with us since our founding and shapes all of our social, political, and economic arrangements to this day. Baldwin called this the lie at the heart of America. And we're protected by the lies we tell ourselves, or at least some of us are. So we tell ourselves that we're the Redeemer nation, we're a shining city on a hill, and we tell ourselves we're the example of democracy achieved. But all of this requires us to deny certain truths about ourselves, about our role in the world, and what we do at home. And in our debasement and definition of Black people, Baldwin argued, white people debased and defined themselves. For Baldwin, the only way out of this was to confront the messiness of who we are so as to release ourselves to be otherwise. We need to do this on both an individual level and a societal level. We have to tell the truth about who we are and what we've done, but the lie gets in the way. We've had many chances to deal with this lie directly, to own up to it and call it what it is. But every time, enough of us have refused to meaningfully engage or finish the job. Incomplete, the lie still stands and even grows stronger as it gets better at disguising itself. And so we're at another inflection point or confrontation point in our history, where we can decide as a nation if we're going to finally grapple with the lie. But at every point in our history where we've come close to confronting the lie and meaningfully dealing with it, it has primarily been Black people who have been the ones challenging us to do so and forcing us to become more and more like what we claim we already are. Black Americans have been the architects of the closest America has ever gotten to being a true democracy. But the lie remains. Or as a great essayist for the New York Times 1619 Project, Nicole Hannah Jones, put it, our democracy's founding ideals were false. And when they were written, Black Americans have fought to make them true. So let's now look at a few of the inflection points in American history to see both how the lie has been maintained and how Black Americans have brought us closer to challenging it. And so Africans were first brought to what would become the US in 1619. There's some debate over how these first captives were treated, as laws allowing slavery were not passed until a few decades later. But certainly, these captives did not come voluntarily and they did not serve willingly. So the debate in a larger sense is really irrelevant to the enslaved population. By the 1660s, certainly, a racially based form of slavery had arisen for the profit of elite whites and to create cross-class alliances among rich and poor whites. By 1700, the majority of the labor force in the most powerful colony in what would become the US was enslaved, and that's Virginia. Centrally, slavery was an economic system based on exploitation, and it was an enormously profitable system that enriched nearly all sectors of the economy. Northern factories spun cotton grown by enslaved Southerners. Wall Street, while being physically built by enslaved laborers, was also financed by capital from slavery. Slave labor produced the major consumer goods that were the basis of world trade. Enslaved labor turned the US from what was essentially a colonial backwater into the second largest economy in the world by 1860. The bodies of enslaved were America's largest asset. Their estimated market value by 1860 was 7 times the value of currency in circulation. I make a point to say this, to include this part about it, because American students, at least, are often taught that slavery was the exception to an otherwise free country. It was this aberration, and it was incidental and not central to the economy. But it was the economy. Slavery in the US was a national system too, and not just a Southern system like we're also often taught. And it's one that touched the very core of the nation's entire economic and political system. So slavery wasn't an aberration or an exception to an otherwise free country. It was a core component of America. But at its heart also, slavery was a system of violence. Violence extracted the labor that built the country. That violence could take the form of the obvious, like I have on the screen with this hard image to look at. And so you could whip someone, an enslaver could whip someone for not working fast enough. Or it could take more subtle forms like an implicit threat of physical, mental, or sexual violence. Regardless, though, violence was at the heart of the system, and the day-to-day reality for the enslaved population was work, near constant work. That was the reality of slavery. Slavery was war, and it was violence, and the labor was all extracted through force, whether it looked explicitly that way or not. That was the shadow hanging over it in every domain, because enslavers could do whatever they wanted to their property. And so violence was used in horrific measures, but always there was the threat of violence as well. Despite the great hardships, enslaved people, though, managed to survive the nearly 250 years of enslavement through families, like this image I have on screen, of 5 generations of one family, right? Which I think disrupts a lot of the common notions of what slavery was like. Certainly families were separated, but they could also be enduring and create strong bonds. And also helping the enslaved population survive was building a vibrant culture. And this culture took things from their African forebears and Anglo-Americans around them and blended them into something entirely new and created a new culture. And this is running through all of American culture, this culture that enslaved and Black Americans created. They also forged a culture of resistance that would help them survive in the years ahead. And so sometimes that meant overt rebellions, some of which are depicted on this map. And there were hundreds that took place before the Civil War. But sometimes rebellions or resistance to slavery meant more subtle forms of resistance that gained its power not from even being perceived as resistance, as they didn't have the power to do overt forms of resistance, but things like breaking tools or pretending not to understand instructions were powerful ways to both let off steam and undermine the system of slavery. While white propagandists maintained that enslaved people were well treated and loved being enslaved, believe it or not, that is what they are maintaining. Enslaved people always desired freedom, and enslavers never managed to crush that desire. And so you can see that in both overt acts of rebellion and more subtle forms. It's important to note, too, that slavery in the US and much of the Western Hemisphere also differed substantially from how slavery had been practiced throughout most of human history. Because of the lie at the heart of the nation, slavery was not just a form of labor, but it was a way of life and the basis for a supposed natural racial hierarchy. In contrast to earlier forms of slavery, escaped slaves in the US were not considered equal to whites and deserving of the same rights, and the same with people born into freedom who were Black. Instead of judging people by their status or free or enslaved, the lie demanded that we create a system in which we judge people by a more permanent feature, the color of their skin. But even as we maintained the big lie, we also saw continual evidence of its falsehood, and thus went to great lengths to prevent Black people from fighting for their freedom. Thomas Jefferson, the writer of the Declaration of Independence, and the third president, who himself over his lifetime enslaved over 600 people, seemed to recognize the injustice of slavery, but feared the consequences of ending it when he said, quote, "We have the wolf by the ear, and we can neither hold him nor safely let him go. Justice is one scale and self-preservation in the other." And so white fears, as embodied by this quote from Jefferson, of Black liberation, underlies so much of our history and our present. Choosing a perceived need for self-preservation over justice, Jefferson and other enslavers set up a system to suppress what they feared most: enslaved people rising up and demanding their freedom. Inherent in Jefferson and others' fear was a recognition of the lie, recognition that Black people were fellow humans with desires to be free as strong as anyone else. If they hadn't been aware that Black people were human, they wouldn't have had to build such a system to monitor and police the Black population in order to suppress them. And so that's just what they did. Enslavers set up a system of slave patrols to keep watch over the enslaved population and deputized all white people to keep the enslaved population in check. Any white person could question a Black person and demand proof of their freedom or permission from their enslaver to be doing whatever they were doing. In some locales, we even mandated that all white men carry guns with them at all times in order that they could step in and suppress a rebellion when needed. The laws gave all white people, and this is quoting from the statutes, absolute authority and responsibility to suppress Black people resisting. And it even mandated punishments for whites who did not fulfill this duty. The modern legacy of this, I think, is clear to us in the frequent calling of the police on a person of color for just going about their lives. And the policies in places like New York to what they call stop and frisk, stop and search and question those that the police deem to be suspicious. Those suspicions are not equally distributed across racial categories. 90% of those stopped in 2017 in New York were African American or Latinx, right? And so it's coded language to say who is and who is not suspicious in this country. And it has nothing to do with a person's behaviors, but our own conceptions that white Americans have been raised with. Well, some of the rebellions against slavery pushed the US closer to grappling with the lie. It wasn't until the carnage of the American Civil War in the 1860s that the US had its first national inflection point in which we could decide if we would continue to uphold the lie or not. I'm sorry, I was a slide behind. And so these are some of the viral videos that you may or may not be familiar with in the last few years of white people calling the police on Black people for nothing at all, quite frankly. And so the American Civil War centered on slavery, but at its start, none of the official combatants wanted to see an end to slavery. And this is also a huge misconception that many American students have about the Civil War, that it was a war to abolish slavery. But at its start, indeed, for the majority of the war, it was not a war to end slavery at all. The white South, known as the Confederacy, fought to uphold and expand slavery. That's certainly true. But at the beginning of the war, the North fought only to keep the Union together. That was their mission. President Abraham Lincoln actually, in his first inaugural address, pledged to enshrine protections for slavery in the Constitution in an attempt to get the South to come back to the Union. It didn't work. Such an amendment was not passed, but it was something he was willing to do. And before this, slavery had been through tricky wording, that word slavery or slave had not been used in the Constitution, but he was willing to enshrine it in the Constitution to get the states who were seceding from the Union, leaving the Union and trying to form the Confederacy to come back to appease them. And so it didn't work, but after much bloodshed, military losses, internal pressure, and thousands of enslaved people using the disruption of war as a means to escape to Union lines and thus freedom, Lincoln was finally forced to act against slavery. He was left with almost no other option but to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring an end to slavery in the areas held by the rebelling states. And so Lincoln is nicknamed the Great Emancipator, but he was willing to enshrine slavery in the Constitution to preserve the Union. And so only through the actions of the Black population, forcing his hand and making the war not just about slavery, but about their freedom, did the US come closer to fixing its founding contradiction and address its lie. Conveniently, though, Lincoln wrote the Emancipation Proclamation such that it would only apply to the areas still in rebellion. So again, it was another trial by Lincoln, attempt by Lincoln to get the Confederacy to come back into the fold without changing slavery. And so you can see by this map, the Emancipation Proclamation, by many measures, did not free anyone because Lincoln issued it to apply only in areas, the brown areas of this map, where he had no power to enforce it. So slavery wouldn't be truly removed at all through the Emancipation Proclamation, but through the 13th Amendment that would come 2 years after in 1865. Let's see. And so it was enslaved people themselves who made the continuation of slavery impossible. as they escaped their bonds or used whites' decreased capacity to police them during the war as an opening to engage in what one eminent scholar described as a general strike and refused to continue to work. And so in states like Kentucky, here in red, which technically had stayed in the Union during the war, 75% of the enslaved population used the war to escape, right? And that was long before they'd been given any permission to do so. So they're forcing Lincoln's hand in many ways. But on top of that, for those in the deep South who could not escape as readily as someone from Kentucky could, withholding their labor from the Confederacy and joining the Union as soldiers made all the difference in the war's outcome. And so the war became, in the words of Lincoln, a new birth of freedom, and therefore a chance to deal with the lie at the heart of the Union, but only after he was pushed, right? And only after 2.5 years of war. And so, echoing Jefferson's fear of retribution for the sin of slavery, Lincoln intoned 4 years into the bloody conflict that, quote, if God will that the war continue till all the wealth piled by the bondsman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword, then so must it be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous, end of quote. And so Lincoln thought that the carnage of war might be just punishment for the sin of slavery. But even the so-called great emancipator stopped short of believing that Blacks and whites could even live in the US on terms of equality. He still believed the lie, and thus at one point he looked for an option to deport the Black population to somewhere outside of the United States. And so even as slavery did not survive the Civil War, the lie remained. The US did not end slavery because it was immoral. We did not do it, or we did not do it because we finally agreed as a nation that it was wrong and that all men were created equal. That's not why we did it. We ended slavery out of military expediency. We needed Black men to serve, and serve they did in over 250 battles of the war. You can see that on the map here too. And so the Union needed more soldiers, and the Black population was eager to fight for their freedom. And every formerly enslaved person armed against Southern rebels also meant one less forced laborer continuing to contribute to the South's economy. And so we ended slavery not just for the right reasons, and just not for the right reasons. Nevertheless, this offered an opportunity to deal with the lie at the heart of our Union. And so for a brief moment, when white Northerners were still infuriated with white Southerners over the bloody war, we moved to fix some of these flaws in our founding documents, and we outlawed slavery, we conveyed citizenship to Black people, and we enfranchised all men. And so for a brief moment, Black men, should be on the slide, sorry. For a brief moment, Black men elected representatives to Congress, reunited families separated under slavery, and pursued education and sought to carve out economic independence. But the lie was a hard one to displace. And so racist beliefs that held that Black people would not work unless they were forced to meant that there would be no reparations for slavery, for the lifetime spent in uncompensated labor, and there would be no land redistribution. Black people had to continue laboring, often on the very same land and under the very same lash of those who had once held them in bondage. And things only grew worse once the white North's anger at the white South lessened. They were willing to overlook white Southerners' attempt to reinstitute slavery in everything but name. As soon as Union troops were withdrawn from the South, white Southerners waged an unrelenting wave of terror against the Black population in an attempt to restore the racial hierarchy that had been created with the lie. And as the famous escaped slave and abolitionist Frederick Douglass chastised his once white Northern allies, he said about this, quote, "When you turned us loose, you gave us no acres. You turned us loose to the sky, to the storm, to the whirlwind. And worst of all, you turned us loose to the wrath of our infuriated masters." And I think that captures right there the intense disappointment and disillusionment many Black Americans faced after they had fought in the Civil War against those who had risen up against the nation, and as well as their over nearly 250 years of uncompensated labor. And they thought they had proved themselves, but not much changed in the aftermath of the war. And you can see that pretty decisively in the sharecropping arrangements that were established after the war. Because of the lack of land redistribution, Black people had to work often for the very same people who once owned them. And sharecropping is essentially an arrangement in which those doing all the work give a portion of the crop at the end of the year to the person who owns the land. And the person always doing the math on what portion that they would get and the value of that would always be the white landowner. And so sharecroppers would often work in very laborious tasks all year. And no matter how much they grew and how good of a harvest they had, somehow at the end of the year, when the landowner was doing the math, they never came out making any money. They always had more deductions for food or tools or seeds or anything like that. And so in the aftermath, the Black community turned inward and built communities to protect themselves. But they were continually met with violence whenever whites believed that they were managing to succeed too well, when they were seemingly disproving the lie. And so on average, from the 1880s to the 1930s, every 4 days, a Black person was lynched, which means ritualistically killed by a spectacle murder by a mob. At least 4,000 Black men, women, and children were murdered in this way. And warning with the images I have ahead, but these were not crimes done in the dead of night with men wearing white hoods, although that certainly happened too. The reason we know about these crimes, the reason we can have maps and graphs like this showing these crimes, is because these were not hidden things. These were public spectacle murders done on purpose that way to convey a larger message to the entire Black community. And so these were public affairs. Many of these images I have on screens were actually from postcards made by the people attending these lynchings so that they could send them to others who weren't present and brag about what they had done, right? These are not secretive things. The Ku Klux Klan appropriately is demonized, but it also misguides our understanding as if that's what we think all of the violence was about. People hiding their faces. They didn't need to hide. They could do this in plain sight. And indeed, how else could you get a crowd of thousands to gather without prior announcements of designated times and places for lynchings? And these were carnival-esque atmospheres where pieces of the victim's body were prized souvenirs and children were held aloft to get a better view, to introduce the lie to the next generation. And so whites justified these barbaric crimes by building a new and more virulent lie that these public killings were necessary to protect white women from the uncontrollable lusts of Black men. But this idea held no more truth than the original lie. Few of the lynch victims were even accused of such crimes. More often, the victims were instead challenging the racial status quo politically, socially, or economically. And Black women were not exempt from the mobs either, further disproving the myth that lynch mobs were a response to Black men's supposed sexual violence against white women. That's not what was going on here. It was about power. It was about maintaining a racial hierarchy, about maintaining the lie. And Black communities did not take these injustices lying down. They fought back through self-defense and protesting these injustices at every turn. They made sure that the world would know of these crimes by documenting as many of them as they could. And so we have extensive detail and documentation of these killings. And other forms of protest beyond just letting the world know what had happened, beyond the 1900 version of pulling out your cell phone and recording it. We have protests. In 1917, for example, was one of the largest, where 10,000 marched down New York's Fifth Avenue in total silence, protesting lynching. They also engaged in boycotts, picketing, and every other form of protest imaginable, decades before the more famous ones of the civil rights movement. That's another misconception that's widespread among American students, that Black Americans were not protesting these things until the civil rights movement. But really, the civil rights movement is only when white Americans started paying attention in more ways to these protests because of international pressure about it. But the violence against them was unrelenting and the lie continued. It only seemed to grow worse as they time and again demonstrated their humanity and equality. After Black Americans, for example, won acclaim and medals by aiding the French in World War I, returning Black veterans were met with violence instead of a welcome home in the summer that became known as the Red Summer. The lie simply couldn't abide by the idea of Black men bravely fighting in a war to make the world safe for democracy. And so in white mob riots against Black people in the summer of 1919 across all of the US, Black people were terrorized and murdered on an unbelievable scale that is not even included in that 4,000 lynching figure. And you can see other examples of this in areas of Black success. Just a few years after the Red Summer in 1921, 100 years ago this year, airplanes were used for the first time to bomb an American city when white mobs attacked the Black section of Tulsa, Oklahoma. This once prosperous area had been known as the Black Wall Street because of its economic success. Its prosperity, however, posed too big of a challenge to the lie and thus needed to be destroyed. Many other Black communities met a similar fate. Tulsa is just one of the most famous of them. And so to escape the wrath of lynch mobs that were primarily but not exclusively in the South, as well as the economic stagnation and the lack of political rights in the South, millions of Black Americans started heading north and west around 1910 in what became known as the Great Migration. And this continued over the next 6 decades, as you can see from the graph. And in doing so, the Black population were not only voting with their feet, right, expressing their opposition to what was happening in the South, and withholding their labor once again from an economy that did not want them to leave. And many white Southerners acted to suppress the Great Migration by refusing to even sell train tickets to Black people, or doing things like withholding wages so that they could not afford these tickets, or stationing guards at the train stations. Nevertheless, over the course of 6 decades, some 6 million African Americans escaped the South. And in doing so, the Black populace recast the nation's demographics as they moved from being an overwhelmingly Southern population of around 90% in the South to about half their population in the South and half in the North. And so our nation looks fundamentally different after the Great Migration has begun than it did before. Systems of oppression, however, followed, as the lie was national and not regional. And what had long been done through mob violence and white terrorist campaigns in the South was now also done by police forces in the North. The Black population was continually monitored, surveilled, and policed in the North. And police forces grew in large measure for this very purpose. That's why they were built. And so once again, Black Americans protested this. They fought back in every respectable way, writing letters, demanding reforms, and even submitting a massive petition to the United Nations in 1951, charging the US with genocide for the killings of unarmed Black men and women by police and by lynch mobs. They didn't distinguish between the two. Black Americans had long insisted that Black lives matter, long before they coined the phrase. But the lie, of course, endured. And periodically, when the respectable channels of protests continued to get them nowhere, frustrations boiled over into riots, or more properly termed uprisings. Most of these uprisings throughout the 20th century were set off by a police killing of an unarmed Black person. That is what launched these riots, these uprisings. But that was just the match that lit the fuse. Fueling the fires was the injustices built into America's system to maintain the lie. Few Black people could succeed economically with discrimination at every turn, and they were kept trapped through governmental policies in deteriorating neighborhoods and inferior services compared to their white neighbors. And so that was also part of why we see these uprisings. And after each riot, the government would commission a report to study what had happened and what could be done to prevent it from happening again. Of course, many of the reports had racist conclusions about the perceived inherent or cultural failings of African Americans, but a surprising number of times, these reports actually recognized what the problems actually were. They recognized the lie. White racism was at fault, report after report concluded. The government commissioned reports offered opportunities to confront the lie and address the underlying issue, but each time the recommendations were ignored. It's all just repeats of justice on one scale and self-preservation for white supremacy in the other. And so illustrating this cyclical process in testimony before the Kerner Commission, a government panel charged with investigating uprisings in over 20 major cities in 1967, Kenneth Clark, a prominent Black psychologist who worked on the Brown versus Board of Education decision, declared, "I read the report of the 1919 riot in Chicago, and it is as if I was reading the report of the investigating committee of the Harlem riot of 35, the report of the investigating committee of the Harlem riot of 43, the report of the McCone Commission on the Watts riot. I must again in candor say to you members of this commission, it is a kind of Alice in Wonderland with the same moving picture re-shown over and over again, the same analysis, the same recommendations, and the same inaction." End of quote. And so what's I think so painful in this statement is that we've long known the lie and how to fix it. We as a nation just haven't had the will to do it. And so the sacrifices and bravery of activists during the civil rights and Black power movements brought the nation closer to confronting the lie and achieved some real reforms that has brought the nation closer to our founding creed, but the lie has continued. Only now it is no longer considered polite to be open with the lie. Racism now needed to be hidden, to be disguised as something else. White politicians no longer openly claimed Black people were racially inferior. Now they spoke of things like a culture of poverty and appealed to white voters in language that evoked race, but didn't name it. And so we started to pretend we couldn't even see race, acting like if we didn't name race, then the legacies of past discrimination and ongoing discrimination no longer mattered or never even existed, that the lie didn't exist. But race continued to matter, not because there were any meaningful racial differences, but because we built our entire society around this false idea of race. And so by any metric, Black Americans were and continue to do less well than white Americans. Schools are still largely segregated, as are neighborhoods. Family income and generational wealth drastically differ by race, as do health outcomes, life expectancy, possibility of imprisonment, and of course, likelihood of being shot by police. And you can see it's in its current and most explicit rendition in the police killings, but also in the effects of the pandemic, where all Americans are not equally subject to it. Black communities' fight against police brutality has been ever present. For example, the Black Panthers of the late 1960s and 1970s initiated the strategy of monitoring the police, and they even recorded them with cameras. 1960s versions of cameras, so they were heavy and bulky and impossible to have viral videos come out of them. But it was 30 years ago this year, just earlier this month, in fact, that a bystander video of the police beating a Black man in LA, Rodney King, first made national headlines and made indisputable, one would think, what Black communities had long been saying about how they were treated by the police. Nevertheless, these officers were found not guilty despite the video footage, and few officers have ever been held accountable, even when they're caught on tape. And so what's changed in recent years isn't how often police violence occurs or how Black people have responded to it. Rather, what's changed is the proliferation of camera phones, which makes it easier to show police violence to the world. This hasn't yet translated into police accountability, as even video footage doesn't seem to be enough to surmount the lie. But the footage and the formation of Black Lives Matter and similar groups since the death of teenager Trayvon Martin in 2012 has brought far wider attention to the subject and brought us as a nation closer to another inflection point. And so we have the chance to confront the lie at our founding of our nation after every rebellion against slavery during the Civil War and the war's aftermath, after seeing mass protests like the Silent Protest Parade, and especially during the civil rights and Black Power movements. Now the Black Lives Matter movement is asking for the nation's founding creed to be upheld. That is what Black Matter means. Black people in this country have been fighting for the right to their very existence, their lives, their bodily integrity for 402 years. But they're saying Black Lives Matter because for most of this country's history, the nation have made it clear that we don't think that these lives matter. Those who don't understand our nation's history or seek to purposefully ignore it, the killings as one-off events, but they are anything but. They're at the heart of our nation's contradiction. And so the ever-growing list of unarmed Black people killed by police and white vigilantes are echoing the nation's long history of mandating all white people police Black people. They were echoing the terrible history of lynching, and the killings drive holes in the logic of those who deny the existence of the lie and want to pretend race or racism isn't a factor, and instead insist that behavior would have kept those people safe. And you can see that in some of these charts of police accountability and about crime. But driving holes in this logic it's about Black hair. Rika Boyd was in a park with friends. Trayvon Martin was walking with Skittles and iced tea. Amar Aubrey was jogging. Orlando Castile was driving home from the grocery store. 12-year-old Tamir Rice was playing the playground. John Crawford, in my hometown, had picked up an air gun on sale at Walmart. Stephen Clark was on his phone in his grandmother's backyard. Botham Jean was eating ice cream on his couch. Casey Goodson was approaching his home, holding a Subway sandwich. Breonna Taylor was sleeping in her bed. And so their deaths and the killings of so many others like them prove that sometimes simply being Black can make you a suspect or get you killed, especially when the police are involved. Looking Black is more likely to get you killed than any other factor. And this isn't anything new. This was built into our system to hold the wolf by the ear. But in fighting for their lives, their rights, and for the idea that Black lives should matter, Black Americans are simply fighting for their existence. And the conflict need not pit white American self-preservation against justice. But the lie continues to make us think that it does. And so protests that were overwhelmingly peaceful last summer have been depicted as violent insurgencies and anarchy. And so I don't know where we as a nation will go. I'm a historian and I focus on the past. But I do know that from history, I know Black Americans will continue to fight for freedom and equality as they always have. So it'll depend largely on white Americans' willingness to finally address the contradiction at the heart of our youth, to address James Baldwin's essay, The White Problem, to confront the lie we tell about ourselves. And so I'm sorry I went a little bit longer than I had planned. And I know that was a lot, but I'm happy to hear any questions, anything at all. I can stop sharing my screen if we want, so we can see each other better. No questions? I explained American history that well?
You did a great job. I'm sure there are questions, it's just materializing them.
It's a lot. Thank you. But I know it's confusing and I know it's a lot to take in. And so yeah, I'm happy to address, usually when I have international students in my classes, a few weeks into the semester, one of them will approach me after class and ask me something along the lines of what I just presented on, because it's racism of course exists throughout the globe, unfortunately, but it works in a particular way in the US that's often different from what's experienced elsewhere. And so it's okay to be a little confused. And also our propaganda machines of history have also led us to think different things. And also I'll put a plug in for, I'm part of the School of Social Transformation, and I'm part of the African and African American Studies Department. And we have many, many scholars working on all kinds of areas within this field. And so if you have further questions, feel free to contact me or any of my colleagues that all work on these issues. Thank you for coming. Appreciate it.
And thank you, Dr. Vinyas Nelson. I can end the recording now. If there's any other questions, feel free to ask them. But this was an amazing program and I learned a lot. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Can you get the recording? I mean, will you guys providing a link for the recording?